On a cool Monday morning in September 2003, two women parked a rented gold Jeep Cherokee at the Crystal Lake trailhead in Utah's Uinta Mountains and began what should have been a simple day hike. By nightfall, 58-year-old Margaret Patterson and her 39-year-old daughter Sarah had vanished. 9 months later, when searchers finally found them, they were 420 feet from a trail that could have saved their lives. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Margaret and Sarah flew into Utah from their homes in the southeast for what was meant to be a week of mountain scenery and quiet time together. They rented a condo in Park City, a resort town that sits an hour and a half from Salt Lake City. The vacation had been planned for months. Sarah, unmarried and working a steady job in Georgia, had coordinated time off to match her mother's schedule. Margaret, living in Florida with her husband Jim, had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The Uinta Mountains are not the Rockies. They run east to west rather than north to south, an anomaly in the American West. Their peaks rarely exceed 12,000 feet, but what they lack in elevation, they compensate for in sheer, unforgiving remoteness. The range holds more than 1,000 lakes, most of them small, many of them unnamed. Dense pine forests grow between them. The terrain looks similar in every direction. It is easy country in which to become confused. The Crystal Lake trailhead sits along the Mirror Lake Highway, a paved two-lane road that crosses Bald Mountain Pass at an elevation just shy of 11,000 feet. During summer, the area sees steady traffic. Families camp at developed sites. Fishermen try their luck in stocked lakes. Hikers walk well-maintained trails through alpine meadows. By September, the crowds thin. Nights grow cold. Weather becomes unpredictable. On the morning of September 8th, Margaret and Sarah encountered a forest ranger at the trailhead. The ranger, a woman named Brenda Caldwell, noticed the cooler temperatures and overcast skies. She advised the two women to bring heavier clothing in case the weather turned. Margaret and Sarah thanked her, drove away briefly, then returned and started their hike. What they wore that day would later be examined in detail. Sarah had on a V-neck sweatshirt. Margaret wore a light T-shirt and later added a thin hooded jacket. Neither woman carried much in the way of emergency gear. Their plan was to complete what guidebooks called the Clyde Lake Loop, a roughly 6-mile circuit that would take them past Wall Lake, through a rocky gap known as a notch, and around Clyde Lake before returning to their vehicle. The route was listed as easy. It followed established trails. Nothing about it suggested danger. The first images from their disposable cameras show Margaret smiling near a pond surrounded by lily pads. The sky is gray but not threatening. Sarah snapped a picture of distant peaks, their slopes green with summer grass. They took photos of each other at Wall Lake, where sheer cliffs rise from the water's edge, and Mount Watson, a prominent 11,000-foot summit, dominates the skyline. In one frame, Margaret sits on a rocky shore wearing just a T-shirt. She looks relaxed. There is no indication she felt cold or concerned. Somewhere between Wall Lake and Clyde Lake, the weather changed. A photo taken near Clyde shows wet rock glistening under a steady drizzle. The smooth granite, polished over millennia by glacial movement, reflected a dark sky. Rain had begun to fall. By the time they reached the northern end of Clyde Lake, conditions had deteriorated enough that Margaret put on her jacket. Then the photograph stopped making sense. If Margaret and Sarah had simply continued around Clyde Lake's southern shore, they would have reconnected with the trail and been back at their Jeep within 2 hours. Instead, the next pictures were taken more than a mile to the west at a small lake called Hidden Lake. This lake does not appear on most casual hiking maps. It sits in a different drainage system entirely. To reach it from Clyde Lake required leaving the trail and crossing a subtle geographic divide. Water on one side flows toward Provo. Water on the other flows toward the Weber River, which empties more than 70 miles away near Ogden. The camera captured 2 images at Hidden Lake's outlet. Both show the same view, a forest-ringed pond under gray skies, rain stippling the surface. Between these 2 nearly identical frames is a third photo, one that has never been successfully located. It shows a small waterfall tumbling over rocks and heavy timber. The location of this cascade remains unknown. Whether it was taken out of sequence or represents a brief detour is unclear. What matters is that Margaret and Sarah were now far from where they intended to be. Their second-to-last photo shows Margaret standing beside a tiny stream south of Hidden Lake. She wears her hooded jacket now, the hood pulled up, but she is smiling. There is no panic in her expression. The final photo, taken from the same meadow, looks south toward a distant ridge. The clouds are high and flat. Rain appears to have eased. Conditions, while far from ideal, do not seem catastrophic. After that, the camera went silent. No more pictures were taken. Whether the film simply ran out or Margaret and Sarah chose to conserve their remaining exposures is unknown. What is certain is that they continued south from that meadow, moving deeper into terrain that offered no trails, no easy landmarks, and no shelter. When Margaret and Sarah failed to board their return flights on Saturday, September 13th, family members contacted police. Park City officers began checking rental car companies. Summit County deputies fanned out the trailheads across the northern Wasatch. On Sunday, a deputy spotted the gold Jeep Cherokee at Crystal Lake. Inside, investigators found a guidebook with Wall Lake and Clyde Lake circled. Back at the condo, they discovered notes showing interest in the Clyde Lake area. Bloodhounds were brought in. The dogs caught a scent near the vehicle and ran north toward Wall Lake, not east toward Clyde. Hasty teams, groups of volunteers trained to move quickly through wilderness, spread out along every trail within a 5-mile radius. They checked Wall Lake, the Notch, the Twin Lakes, Clyde Lake, and a network of smaller paths leading to Long Lake and beyond. For 10 straight days, more than 100 searchers combed the high country. They found nothing. The initial theory was that Margaret and Sarah had become disoriented in bad weather somewhere near Long Lake, and wandered into the drainage of the middle fork of the Weber River. This explanation seemed reasonable. The storm that moved through on September 8th and 9th brought rain, dropping temperatures into the low 30s. By September 10th, freezing conditions arrived. Snow dusted the peaks. Hypothermia, investigators concluded, was the likely cause of death. But Long Lake is 3 miles east of where the Jeep was parked. Bloodhounds had not run east. They had run north. And no physical evidence, no torn fabric, no abandoned gear, no footprints, suggested Margaret and Sarah had ever been near Long Lake. As autumn progressed, search efforts scaled back. Other emergencies demanded attention. The reality set in that the two women were almost certainly dead. Still, on weekends, small groups of volunteers returned to Uintas, walking trails and scanning the forest for any sign. Winter arrived. Snow buried the high country under several feet of accumulation. The Mirror Lake Highway was closed to wheeled traffic. Searchers could do nothing but wait for spring. In late June of the following year, nearly 9 months after Margaret and Sarah disappeared, a group of search and rescue volunteers were conducting a training exercise in the middle fork of the Weber River drainage. One of them noticed a flash of reflected sunlight, a small piece of metallic emergency blanket wedged into a rock crevice. They approached and found a crude shelter formed by 2 pieces of fractured boulder. The space between them was barely large enough for a child to crawl inside. Scattered around a rock were the remnants of 2 lives, a backpack, water bottles, a map, matches that had never been struck, and clothing hung as if to dry. The remains of Margaret Patterson and Sarah Patterson were recovered that day. DNA testing later confirmed their identities. The location sat just off the Middle Fork Weber River Trail, a faint, poorly maintained path that connects the area near Clyde Lake to trails farther west. Margaret and Sarah had been 420 feet from that trail. Had they found it, a 3-mile walk would have brought them to an intersection with a major route leading directly back to their vehicle. The Summit County Sheriff's Office released a statement explaining that the women had likely become lost in a storm and made a wrong turn near Long Lake, ending up in the Middle Fork drainage by accident. The media repeated this narrative. It became the accepted version of events. But it was wrong. 3 years after bodies were found, the photographs from Margaret and Sarah's camera were developed and published online. Hikers who knew the area immediately recognized landmarks: Wall Lake, the Notch, Hope Lake, and, critically, Hidden Lake, not Long Lake. The pictures proved beyond doubt that Margaret and Sarah had gone west from Clyde Lake, not east. They had left the trail intentionally or had lost sight of it in conditions that, while wet and cool, were not blinding. They had navigated more than a mile of off-trail terrain and stopped at a small campsite south of Hidden Lake, where they took their final photographs. Why they left the trail remains unknown. Some have theorized they were attempting to shortcut back to the trailhead by circling around Mount Watson. If so, they were trying to reach the Middle Fork Weber River Trail, the same trail that would later be found heartbreakingly close to where they died. Others believe they became disoriented and followed water downhill, not realizing they crossed from one river drainage into another. A third possibility is that they sought shelter from rain and, once off the trail, could not find their way back. What the photographs do reveal is that Margaret and Sarah were not in a state of blind panic. The second-to-last image shows Margaret smiling. The final shot, looking south across a meadow toward a distant ridge, was taken under skies that had partially cleared. Rain had stopped or diminished to a drizzle. If they believed themselves to be in mortal danger at that moment, it does not show. The hike from that meadow to the shelter rock would have covered less than half a mile, but the terrain is unforgiving. Steep slopes tangle with down timber, hidden streams cutting through thick forest, rocky ground that shifts underfoot. In dry conditions, the walk is challenging. In rain, with wet soles and cold hands, it becomes treacherous. At some point, Margaret and Sarah made the decision to stop. They found a fractured boulder with a narrow cleft and wedged themselves into the small space. They hung wet clothing from a pine branch balanced across the rock's upper joint. They spread a thin emergency blanket over the gap to block rain. They had matches, but no evidence suggests they were able to start a fire. Whether matches were too wet, the wood too damp, or they were simply too cold and exhausted to gather kindling, no one knows. Hypothermia does not require sub-zero temperatures. At 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a soaked person can lose body heat faster than their metabolism can generate it. Shivering, the body's first defense, burns calories and provides temporary warmth. But shivering eventually stops. Confusion sets in. Fine motor skills fail. The cold becomes a weight that presses down, making it difficult to think, to move, to care. The National Weather Service data from a station less than a mile from the trailhead recorded lows in the low 30s on September 8th and 9th. Daytime highs reached only the low 50s. Rainfall totaled 0.7 of an inch over 2 days. Winds were light, just a few miles per hour. Conditions were uncomfortable, not extreme, but Margaret and Sarah were wearing cotton. Once wet, cotton loses its insulating properties. It clings to the skin, drawing heat away. Hikers call it killer. They were dressed for a short walk on a cool day, not for survival. By the time searchers found the shelter rock 9 months later, little remained. Scavengers and weather had scattered what the cold had taken. The scene told a story of two people who had done what they could with what they had. They sought cover. They tried to stay dry. They did not give up, but the mountain gave them nothing in return. The investigation concluded that Margaret and Sarah likely died within hours of taking shelter, probably on the same night they began their hike. Temperatures at evening dropped to 33 degrees. Rain continued intermittently. Wet, exhausted, and unable to generate warmth, they would have slipped into unconsciousness as their core body temperatures fell. Death would have followed quietly. In the years since, questions have persisted. Why did they leave the trail at Clyde Lake? If they knew about the Middle Fork Weber River Trail, why not aim higher on the slope, where travel would have been easier? If they were lost and following water, why leave Hidden Lake's outlet and walk south into increasingly difficult terrain? One detail offers a possible answer. The shelter rock sits at an elevation of just over 10,000 feet. The Middle Fork Weber River Trail crosses a saddle between Mount Watson and Long Mountain at 10,400 feet. To reach that saddle from where their last photo was taken, Margaret and Sarah would have needed to climb about 200 vertical feet over rough ground. Staying level or even descending slightly would have felt easier in the moment, but doing so placed them below the trail. They were so close. The Forest Service ranger who spoke with them at the trailhead that morning later said she had warned them about the weather. She told them to bring warmer clothes. They left, then returned. Whether they added layers to their packs or simply decided the risk was acceptable is not recorded. What is clear is that their clothing, when found, was inadequate for the conditions they encountered. Margaret's husband, Jim, told reporters he believed a GPS unit might have saved their lives. Perhaps. But GPS devices in 2003 were not the ubiquitous smartphones of today. They were expensive, battery-dependent tools used primarily by serious backpackers. Even with GPS, Margaret and Sarah would have needed to recognize they were off course and have the physical ability to correct it. Wet, cold, and growing hypothermic, technology might not have helped. The Uinta Mountains have a history of taking people. A 12-year-old boy named Garrett Bardsley vanished near Clyde Lake in 2004 and has never been found. An Australian hiker named Eric Robinson disappeared on the Uinta Highline Trail in 2011. His remains were not located until 2016. 3-year-old Benjamin Mirup went missing near Haystack Lake in 2007, but was found alive after 8.5 hours, hypothermic but breathing. The range is unforgiving. It does not announce its dangers with signs or warnings. It simply waits. Margaret Patterson and Sarah Patterson were not reckless. They planned their hike. They brought a map. They stayed together. They made decisions that, in the moment, likely seemed reasonable. A slight deviation to avoid rough terrain. A search for shelter when rain intensified. A choice to keep moving rather than retrace their steps. Small errors compounding into catastrophe. The photographs they left behind document more than a failed hike. They show a mother and daughter who smile for the camera even as conditions worsened, who took time to frame shots of scenery and each other, who did not yet know that the mountain had already claimed them. Their bodies were returned to their families. Memorial services were held. The investigation was closed. But the questions remain. At what moment did they realize they were lost? When did concern turn to fear? Did they know how close they were to the trail? Did they believe help would come? In the final hours, as cold seeped into their bones and strength drained away, did they find comfort in being together? We will never know. The mountain keeps its secrets. What we do know is this. 2 women left the parking lot on a September morning, expecting to return by afternoon. They carried a camera, some water, a map that did not show all the trails, and a belief that the weather would hold. They died within sight of routes that could save them, separated from safety by a distance a person could walk in 5 minutes. And for 9 months, as snow fell and spring returned and searchers walked past within a few hundred feet, they rested undiscovered in a cleft of stone, waiting to be found. The Forest Service now maintains better signage in the area. Trail maps have been updated. Rangers continue to warn hikers about weather, but people still venture into the Uintas unprepared. They still underestimate the cold. They still believe that a simple day hike cannot end in death. Margaret and Sarah's story is a reminder that wilderness does not grade on effort. It does not care about intentions or plans. It responds only to preparation and respect. A mountain will take what it can, when it can, without malice and without mercy. The shelter rock still stands. Hikers occasionally find it, though its exact location is not widely published out of respect for the families. Wildflowers grow around it in summer. Snow buries it in winter. The cleft remains, a narrow gap between fractured stone, just large enough to offer the illusion of protection. Some who visit leave small tokens. Others simply stand for a moment, imagining what those final hours must have been like. Then they turn and walk back to the trail, grateful for the path beneath their feet and the car waiting at the end. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If you've hiked the Uintas or lost someone to the mountains, or simply wondered how quickly things can go wrong in the backcountry, share your thoughts below.